Imagine a world where humans were bought and sold like cattle. A world where the mighty Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. In the year 73 before Christ, on a seemingly ordinary day, something extraordinary happened that would shake this empire to its very foundations. In the bustling streets of Capua, a city known for its brutal gladiatorial games, a man named Spartacus dared to dream of freedom. But he wasn't just any slave. He was a gladiator, trained to fight and die for the entertainment of Rome's elite. A man who had once been a free Thracian warrior, now forced to spill blood in the arena. What makes a person risk everything for freedom? Picture yourself in Spartacus's sandals, watching your fellow slaves being beaten, tortured, and killed for sport. Would you accept your fate, or would you rise up, knowing that failure meant a death more horrible than anything the arena could offer? This isn't just another tale of rebellion. This is the story of how 74 gladiators, armed with nothing but kitchen knives and their iron will, sparked the largest slave revolt the Roman Empire had ever seen. A revolt that would grow to include more than 100,000 people, defeat 9 Roman armies, and strike terror into the heart of the mightiest empire on earth. From the gladiatorial schools of Capua to the snow-capped peaks of Mount Vesuvius, from desperate battles against impossible odds to moments of incredible strategic brilliance, Spartacus and his followers would write their names in blood across the pages of history. You might think you know this story from Hollywood movies or television shows, but the real tale is far more fascinating. It's a story of brotherhood forged in chains, of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things, and of how the actions of one man can change the course of history. So join me as we journey back 2,000 years to uncover the true story of Spartacus, the slave who became a legend, the gladiator who became a general, and the man who dared to challenge the might of Rome itself. Before we begin this epic tale, make sure you're part of our growing community of history enthusiasts. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join the ranks of the Imperium Chronicles. Together, we'll explore the greatest stories history has to offer, one epic tale at a time. The year is 73 before Christ, and our story begins in the shadow of the arena. The gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua wasn't just a training ground, it was a living nightmare. Here, men were transformed into weapons, their humanity stripped away with each crack of the whip. Imagine being awakened before dawn, chains rattling against cold stone floors, forced to train until your muscles screamed for mercy. Spartacus, like his fellow gladiators, endured a brutal regime that would break most men. They trained with wooden weapons weighing twice as much as real ones, making their actual combat weapons feel light as feathers. Their diet was carefully controlled: barley, beans, and dried fruit to build muscle. Those who survived became living weapons, their bodies hardened by endless drills and mock battles. But there was something different about Spartacus. The Roman historian Plutarch tells us he was not just physically powerful, but educated and remarkably intelligent. More Greek in his sensibilities than the barbarian his masters believed him to be. He had been a Thracian warrior before being captured and sold into slavery, and the memories of freedom never left him. In the winter of 73 before Christ, Spartacus and a small group began plotting their escape. The plan was incredibly risky. Using nothing but kitchen utensils and makeshift weapons, 74 gladiators would attempt something unprecedented: a break from one of the most secure facilities in Capua. What happened next became legend. They overpowered their guards using kitchen knives and cleavers, fighting their way to the gladiatorial armory. Once armed with real weapons, they became an unstoppable force. Think about it. These were men trained to kill, now fighting for their very freedom. The guards didn't stand a chance, but escaping was just the beginning. As they fled into the countryside, Spartacus showed his true genius. Instead of running straight for freedom, he did something extraordinary. He organized. The former slave understood that survival meant turning this band of escaped gladiators into a real fighting force. In the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, Spartacus transformed his followers. He taught them Roman military tactics, the very techniques used by their oppressors. Former house slaves learned to march in formation. Field workers became skilled with the sword. He created a real army from men society had thrown away. What made Spartacus different from other rebel leaders was his vision. He didn't just want to escape. He wanted to build something new. Under his leadership, the rebels created their own society. They shared their plunder equally, banned private property, and treated all escaped slaves as equals, regardless of their origin. Word spread quickly across the Italian countryside. Slaves began running away from their masters in droves, seeking the man who dared to challenge Rome itself. What started as 74 desperate gladiators soon grew into thousands, then tens of thousands. Field slaves, house slaves, shepherds, and even poor free men joined his ranks. But the Romans were about to learn just how dangerous Spartacus could be. Their first attempt to crush this rebellion would lead to one of the most remarkable battles in military history, the Battle of Mount Vesuvius. Rome's greatest mistake was treating Spartacus's rebellion as just another minor slave uprising. After all, slave revolts were common throughout the empire, but they usually ended quickly and brutally. But this time, things would be different. When news reached Rome that 74 gladiators had escaped from Capua, the Senate barely raised an eyebrow. They sent a small local militia to handle what they saw as a simple police matter. This arrogance would cost them dearly. The escaped gladiators had found refuge on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, the same volcano that would later destroy Pompeii. From this natural fortress, Spartacus demonstrated his tactical genius. Instead of facing Roman forces head-on, he employed guerrilla warfare tactics that would become legendary. Picture this: small bands of former slaves striking Roman outposts in the dead of night, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They would attack supply lines, raid armories, and disappear into the wilderness before reinforcements could arrive. With each victory, more slaves joined their ranks, and their arsenal grew. But it was the Battle of Mount Vesuvius that truly shocked Rome out of its complacency. The Roman praetor Claudius Glaber had laid siege to the mountain, blocking the only known path up or down. He was confident that hunger and thirst would force the rebels to surrender. What he didn't count on was Spartacus's ingenuity. In what would become one of the most brilliant tactical moves in military history, Spartacus ordered his men to weave long ropes from wild vines growing on the mountain. Under cover of darkness, the entire rebel army quietly descended the steep cliffs on these makeshift ropes, circling behind the unsuspecting Roman forces. When dawn broke, Glaber's men found their camp under attack from all sides. The Romans, caught completely off guard, were routed. Their weapons and supplies now belonged to Spartacus's growing army. This wasn't just a victory, it was a humiliation that sent shockwaves through Rome. The clever part? Spartacus had noticed that the Romans hadn't bothered to fortify their rear position. Why would they? The cliffs were supposedly unclimbable. This assumption proved fatal for Glaber's forces and marked the beginning of a series of embarrassing defeats for Rome. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the early phase of the rebellion. Roman commanders, convinced they were dealing with simple slaves, underestimated Spartacus time and time again. Each defeat attracted more followers to the rebel cause. Slaves, peasants, and even some free men began to see Spartacus not just as a rebel leader, but as a symbol of resistance against Roman oppression. By the end of that year, Spartacus's army had swollen from 74 escaped gladiators to over 10,000 fighters. They had defeated 2 Roman praetors and several militias, captured 3 legionary eagles, and controlled a significant portion of southern Italy. The Roman Senate could no longer ignore this minor slave uprising. The time had come to take this threat seriously. But by then, Spartacus's legend was already growing beyond their control. As word of Spartacus's victories spread across Italy, what began as a gladiator uprising transformed into something unprecedented. A revolution of the oppressed. The rebellion grew beyond anyone's wildest expectations, swelling from a few thousand fighters to over 100,000 souls. This wasn't just an army. It was an entire society on the move. They came from everywhere. Household slaves who poisoned their masters and fled in the night. Miners who broke their chains and emerged from the darkness. Shepherds who knew every hidden path in the mountains. But it wasn't just slaves. Poor farmers crushed by debt joined the cause. Outcasts, criminals, and even some free citizens who despised Rome's corruption flocked to Spartacus's banner. Women and children formed a crucial part of this mobile community. They worked as healers, craftspeople, and scouts. Some women even fought alongside the men, breaking every convention of Roman society. The rebels set up their own system of distribution, sharing food, weapons, and plunder equally, a radical idea in a world of strict social hierarchies. But success brought its own challenges. After several major victories, Spartacus faced a crucial decision that would shape the fate of the rebellion. Should they escape Italy by crossing the Alps into freedom, or should they stay and fight to liberate more slaves? This question split the rebel army into factions. Spartacus himself favored crossing the Alps. He knew that every passing day made Rome stronger and more determined. His military experience told him that eventually, Rome's vast resources would prove overwhelming. Beyond the Alps lay freedom and the chance for his people to build new lives. But Crixus, a Gallic gladiator and one of Spartacus's most trusted commanders, had different ideas. He argued passionately for continuing the fight in Italy. Why flee when they were winning? Every victory brought more recruits and resources. Crixus dreamed of turning Italy upside down, of breaking the power of Rome itself. Oinomaus, another former gladiator leader, proposed a third strategy, splitting their forces to strike multiple targets, making it impossible for Rome to concentrate its armies. This debate created deep divisions within the rebel army. These conflicting strategies revealed a fundamental tension in the rebellion. Was this a fight for freedom or a war of revenge? Should they prioritize the survival of their people or pursue the dream of revolutionary change? The inability to resolve these questions would prove costly. The rebels' greatest strength, their diversity, became a source of weakness. Different groups had different goals. Some wanted to return to their homelands, others dreamed of building a new society, and some simply lived for the next battle and its spoils. As the rebel army debated its future, Rome was learning from its defeats. The Senate was preparing to send its most formidable generals and largest armies yet. Time was running out for the rebels to resolve their differences. In a twist of tragic irony, the very success that had transformed a band of escaped gladiators into the largest slave rebellion in history now threatened to tear it apart from within. The question that had started it all, the dream of freedom, had become complicated by success, power, and competing visions of what that freedom should look like. What would you have done in Spartacus's position? Would you have chosen the certainty of escape, or risked everything for the chance to change the world? These weren't just questions for Spartacus and his followers. They're questions that revolutionaries have grappled with throughout history, right up to the present day. After suffering multiple humiliating defeats, Rome finally realized it needed someone exceptional to end Spartacus's rebellion. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome and perhaps in all of history. To understand just how rich Crassus was, consider this. He owned most of Rome's real estate and had a fortune that in today's terms would be worth over $20 billion. He made much of this wealth by buying burning buildings at bargain prices while his private fire brigade stood by, only extinguishing the flames after he completed the purchase. But Crassus wasn't just wealthy. He was ambitious. He saw the Spartacus rebellion as his chance to gain military glory and political power. While other generals had failed with public funds, Crassus raised and equipped 8 new legions with his own money. That's about 40,000 men, armed and trained at private expense, something unprecedented in Roman history. Yet Crassus faced a serious problem. Years of defeats had shattered the Roman army's discipline and morale. His soldiers were more likely to run from Spartacus than fight him. Crassus decided to solve this problem with one of the most brutal acts of military discipline ever recorded: decimation. Here's how it worked. Soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots, and the one who drew the short straw was beaten to death by his 9 companions. Imagine being forced to kill your fellow soldier, someone you'd trained with, eaten with, fought beside. The psychological impact was devastating. In one day, Crassus executed 500 of his own men, not for any crime, but simply to make an example. His message was clear: fear your commander more than you fear the enemy. The decimation worked. The Roman army was transformed from a demoralized rabble into a disciplined fighting force. But Crassus wasn't done. He studied Spartacus's tactics and realized that trying to defeat the rebels in open battle was too risky. Instead, he would trap them like rats in a cage. In one of the most ambitious engineering projects of ancient warfare, Crassus built what became known as the Wall of Death. Picture this: a fortification system stretching 37 miles across the toe of Italy from sea to sea. The wall was 15 feet high and included a deep trench 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Guard towers were placed every 100 feet. Built in weeks by thousands of laborers, it was designed to prevent Spartacus from moving north again. This wasn't just a wall. It was a statement of Rome's overwhelming resources and determination. While Spartacus's army had to forage and hunt for supplies, Crassus could feed his men indefinitely through sea routes. While the rebels were trapped in the increasingly barren countryside of southern Italy, Crassus's men were well supplied and protected. What made this strategy particularly clever was that it forced Spartacus to face an enemy he couldn't defeat: time. Every day the rebels spent trapped behind the wall meant less food, more desperation, and growing discord among his followers. Crassus didn't need to defeat Spartacus in battle. He just needed to wait. The wall presented Spartacus with an impossible choice: attempt a suicidal assault on the fortifications, or slowly watch his army starve and disintegrate. This was no longer a contest of military skill or courage. It was a brutal game of resources and willpower, and Crassus held all the cards. As winter approached, conditions behind the wall became desperate. The once mighty rebel army that had terrorized Italy was being defeated not by Roman swords, but by hunger, cold, and the inexorable logic of siege warfare. Crassus had turned the entire southern peninsula into a death trap, and Spartacus was running out of options. Trapped between Crassus's wall and the approaching armies of Pompey and Lucullus, Spartacus knew his time was running out. In the spring of 71 before Christ, near the Sila River in southern Italy, the final chapter of this extraordinary rebellion would be written in blood. Before the battle, Spartacus performed a symbolic act that has echoed through history. He took his war horse, a magnificent stallion gifted to him after a victory, and killed it in front of his troops. "If we win," he declared, "I'll have plenty of horses. If we lose, I won't need one." This powerful gesture showed his men there would be no retreat, no escape. Victory or death were the only options. The morning of the battle, Spartacus arranged his army differently than ever before. Instead of the guerrilla tactics that had served him so well, he organized his forces in the Roman style, a final irony in his war against Rome. His army, though still numbering in the tens of thousands, was a shadow of its former strength. Hunger, desertion, and previous battles had taken their toll. What followed was not so much a battle as a hurricane of violence. Spartacus led the charge himself, cutting through the Roman lines like a whirlwind, fighting his way toward Crassus himself. Ancient historians tell us he killed 2 centurions in single combat, displaying the fighting skills that had made him a legendary gladiator. But for every Roman that fell, 2 more took his place. The rebel army fought with the desperation of men and women who knew defeat meant death or re-enslavement. But Crassus's disciplined legions held firm. Slowly, inevitably, the rebels' formation began to crack under the relentless pressure of Roman tactics and superior numbers. Here's where history becomes clouded in mystery. According to some accounts, Spartacus died as he had lived, fighting to the last, surrounded by enemies, taking dozens of Romans with him before finally falling. Other sources say he was wounded in the thigh by a pike thrust and continued fighting from his knees until overwhelmed. The most intriguing fact? His body was never found. The mystery of Spartacus's final moments has captivated imaginations for over 2,000 years. Did he fall in battle, as the sources claim? Did he escape in the chaos, living out his days in anonymity? We'll never know for certain, and perhaps that's fitting. Like all great legends, Spartacus belongs as much to myth as to history. What we do know is that the Roman vengeance was terrible. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. For 120 miles, crosses lined both sides of the road. This was not just execution, it was a message. Every traveler on this busy highway would see the price of defying Rome. The crucified were left to die slowly, a process that could take days. They were denied even the mercy of a quick death. Crassus ordered that the bodies remain on display until they rotted away completely, creating a corridor of death that would haunt travelers for months. Yet even this brutal ending couldn't erase what Spartacus and his followers had achieved. For 3 years, they had humbled the mighty Roman Republic. Slaves and outcasts had defeated consuls and praetors. They had shown that the powerless could challenge an empire. The Romans tried to erase Spartacus from history, but they failed. No monument was ever built to commemorate his defeat. No triumph was celebrated in Rome. Yet his name lived on, whispered among slaves, celebrated by rebels, remembered by those who dream of freedom. Perhaps the greatest tribute to Spartacus is that 2,000 years later we're still telling his story. Not as a footnote in Roman history, but as a testament to the unquenchable human spirit and the eternal struggle for freedom. In the end, Rome won the battle, but Spartacus won immortality. Though Spartacus fell, his legacy proved far more enduring than Rome could have imagined. For centuries after his death, the mere mention of his name would send shivers through the halls of power. The Romans even banned slaves from speaking his name, fearing it held a power of its own. And perhaps they were right. In the decades following the rebellion, slave revolts became far more organized and dangerous. Slaves would invoke Spartacus's name like a battle cry, and slave owners lived in constant fear of another uprising. In Sicily, Syria, and across the empire, new rebellions erupted, each inspired by the gladiator who had shaken Rome to its core. But Spartacus's influence went far beyond inspiring other slave revolts. The rebellion forced Rome to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their entire economic system was built on a powder keg. The Senate passed new laws limiting the number of slaves that could be kept in one place. They improved conditions in gladiatorial schools and regulated the treatment of slaves. While these reforms weren't made out of compassion, they showed how deeply Spartacus had scared the Roman elite. Perhaps the most fascinating part of Spartacus's legacy is how his story has been reinvented throughout history to serve different causes. In the 1800s, revolutionaries across Europe adopted him as a symbol of resistance against oppression. Karl Marx called him the most splendid fellow in all ancient history, and named him as one of history's great revolutionaries. During the American Civil War, abolitionists invoked Spartacus's name in their fight against slavery. In the 1900s, his story inspired labor movements, civil rights activists, and freedom fighters worldwide. Even today, protesters and activists often carry signs bearing his name. Hollywood, too, fell in love with Spartacus. The 1960 movie starring Kirk Douglas became a classic, but it also carried a deeper message. Made during the height of the Cold War, when many Hollywood writers and actors were being blacklisted, the film's famous "I Am Spartacus" scene became a powerful statement against political oppression. When captured rebels each claimed to be Spartacus to protect their leader, they express a solidarity that resonated far beyond ancient Rome. But perhaps Spartacus's most powerful legacy is as a reminder that the human spirit can't be permanently chained. He proved that even the most oppressive system can be challenged, that the seemingly powerless can shake the foundations of empire. He showed that defeat isn't always failure. Sometimes the act of resistance itself changes the world. Modern archaeologists continue to uncover new evidence of the rebellion's impact. Recent discoveries suggest that the revolt was even larger than historical sources claimed, with rebel camps found across southern Italy. Each discovery adds new chapters to this incredible story. What's particularly remarkable is how Spartacus continues to inspire new generations in ways the Romans could never have imagined. His name appears in everything from sports teams to political movements, from video games to space missions. A galaxy cluster discovered by astronomers is named Spartacus, eternally commemorating his spirit of rebellion among the stars. In the end, Spartacus achieved something far greater than military victory. He became an idea, a symbol of the eternal human struggle for freedom and dignity. While Rome's mighty emperors are remembered mainly by historians, Spartacus lives on in the hearts and imagination of people worldwide. His real victory wasn't on the battlefield. It was in showing that no power, no matter how absolute it seems, is truly invincible. As we face our own struggles for justice and freedom today, Spartacus's legacy reminds us that the most powerful weapon against oppression isn't the sword. It's the courage to stand up and say, "No more." In that sense, the rebellion that began with 74 gladiators in a cooking school in Capua never really ended. It lives on wherever people fight for their freedom and dignity. The story of Spartacus represents far more than a simple military uprising. It stands as one of history's most powerful reminders that the human spirit cannot be forever bound by chains, no matter how strong they might seem. Think about it. A Thracian slave, forced to fight for Roman entertainment, transformed into a leader who challenged the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. His army didn't just fight for freedom, they created their own society, one where former slaves could live with dignity, where plunder was shared equally, where women could fight alongside men, and where one's worth wasn't determined by birth. For 3 extraordinary years, Spartacus and his followers achieved what many thought impossible. They defeated Roman legions, outmaneuvered consuls, and showed that even the most oppressive system has its weaknesses. Though their rebellion was ultimately crushed, their struggle changed Rome forever. The empire would never again feel completely secure in its dominion over the enslaved. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Spartacus's story is how it continues to resonate today. When we see people rising up against oppression, fighting for their rights, or standing up to seemingly invincible power, we're witnessing echoes of that same spirit that inspired 74 gladiators to risk everything for freedom. The questions Spartacus and his followers faced are still relevant. When is the price of freedom worth the risk? How do you maintain unity in a diverse movement? Should you compromise for survival or fight for total change? These aren't just historical curiosities. They're dilemmas that modern movements for justice and freedom still grapple with. What would Spartacus make of our world today? Would he recognize our own struggles for dignity and justice? What would he think of how his name has become synonymous with resistance and the fight for freedom? His story reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about human beings making tough choices in impossible situations. It's about the courage to stand up when standing up seems futile. It's about daring to imagine a different world, even when the cost of that imagination might be everything. As we conclude this journey through one of history's most inspiring rebellions, remember that Spartacus's legacy lives on, not just in books and movies, but in every act of resistance against oppression, in every fight for human dignity, in every dream of freedom. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about power, resistance, and human dignity, then Spartacus is still doing what he did 2,000 years ago, inspiring people to believe in the possibility of change. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What aspects of Spartacus's story resonated most with you? What other rebellions and revolutionaries from history would you like to learn about? Join our community at Imperium Chronicles, where we bring history's most dramatic and meaningful stories to life. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and what we might become. Subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more fascinating journeys into the stories that shaped our world. Until our next adventure through time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop fighting for what you believe in. This is Imperium Chronicles, where history comes alive, one story at a time.